In Nebraska, a cocky cop lied in court, unaware his target was a living legend. When her truth hit, jaws dropped. A story of courage against injustice. You won't believe what happens next. Join us now. The Grand County Courthouse stood like a weathered sentinel in the heart of Nebraska, its limestone facade etched with decades of wind and whispers. Inside, the morning sun clawed through heavy burgundy curtains, spilling thin, golden shafts across the polished oak floor of Courtroom 3. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and anticipation, a stillness that felt more like a held breath than peace. Rows of benches, their varnish chipped from years of restless hands, brimmed with a restless crowd. Locals in faded flannel, their arms crossed tight. Reporters hunched over notepads, pens scratching like impatient insects, and a scattering of faces taut with unspoken stakes, their eyes darting as if searching for answers in the dust motes dancing in the light. At the defense table sat Lena Carter, a figure carved from quiet defiance. Her rich brown skin glowed subtly under the courtroom's artificial hum, a soft contrast to the stark gray blouse and navy skirt she wore. Simple, deliberate choices that cloaked her in humility, yet hinted at something unyielding. Her hair, braided into tight, orderly rows, rested atop her head like a crown she didn't flaunt, a testament to discipline rather than vanity. She sat upright, her spine a steel rod, her hands clasped lightly in her lap with the precision of someone who'd learned to steady them under pressure. Her hazel eyes, sharp and unblinking, swept the room like a hawk's, cataloging the fidgeting bailiff, the reporter chewing a pencil, the woman in the back row twisting a handkerchief. To the casual observer, she was just another soul caught in the legal churn. To those who lingered on her gaze, a quiet intensity simmered, a spark that didn't belong to someone facing petty charges. The room stirred as the bailiff's voice cut through the haze, a gravelly bark that jolted spines straight. All rise for the Honorable Judge Edwin Marshall. The crowd obeyed, a rustle of fabric and creaking wood filling the space as the judge entered. Edwin Marshall was a man worn by time, his silver hair thinning at the crown, his face a map of creases etched by decades on the bench. His black robe swished with each step, a mantle of authority draped over shoulders that sagged slightly, as if the weight of too many cases had pressed them down. He settled into his high-backed chair, his dark eyes scanning the room with a weariness that belied the spark of curiosity glinting beneath. This case, State versus Lena Carter, had already rippled through the small town, its whispers amplified by local news vans parked outside, their antennas piercing the sky. Across the aisle, Officer Nathan Pierce sat at the plaintiff's table, a study in smug assurance. His police uniform was crisp, the brass buttons polished to a mirror sheen, his pale blue eyes glinting with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His sandy hair was cropped short, military style, and his broad frame filled the chair with a presence that demanded attention. He leaned back slightly, one arm draped over the armrest, a faint smirk tugging at his lips as he surveyed the room, less a man on trial than a performer awaiting applause. Beside him, a cluster of fellow officers lined the back row, their uniforms a silent wall of blue, their nods a quiet pledge of loyalty. To them, Pierce was untouchable, a brother in arms whose word carried the weight of gospel. The bailiff's voice boomed again, sharp and formal. Court is now in session. Case number 24-197, State versus Lena Carter. A murmur swept through the gallery, heads craning for a better view as Lena rose from her seat. Her movements were measured, deliberate, each step a quiet assertion, each breath a controlled rhythm. She faced Judge Marshall, her expression a mask of calm that betrayed none of the storm brewing beneath. The whispers grew louder, a low hum of speculation buzzing like static. Who was she? Why her? What had she done to draw Pierce's ire? At her side, her attorney, Jamal Hayes, fidgeted with a stack of notes, his youthful frame dwarfed by the courtroom's grandeur. Fresh from law school, his charcoal suit was sharp, but his hands trembled slightly, betraying nerves he couldn't quite bury. His dark skin glistened with a sheen of sweat under the lights, and he cast a quick glance at Lena, seeking reassurance in her steady presence. She didn't return it. Her focus remained locked on the judge, her hazel eyes unreadable, a fortress he couldn't breach. Jamal cleared his throat, rising with a slight wobble. "Your Honor," he began, his voice thin but gaining strength. "We're prepared to proceed." Judge Marshall nodded, his gaze shifting to Pierce. "Officer Pierce, you may take the stand," he said, his tone neutral but laced with a fatigue that hinted at years of hearing tales spin into tangles. Pierce stood with a flourish, adjusting his uniform as if stepping onto a stage, his boots clicking against the floor with exaggerated purpose. He paused briefly, his eyes flicking to Lena, his smirk faint but unmistakable, a hunter sizing up prey. She met his gaze, unflinching, her mind already dissecting him. The slight tremor in his fingers, the way his shoulders squared too hard. A man overcompensating for something she couldn't yet name. As Pierce took the oath, his hand steady on the Bible, Lena's calm deepened, a stillness honed by years unseen by this room. The crowd leaned in, hungry for the story he'd weave, unaware that the woman they watched held secrets that could shift the very ground beneath them. The gavel hung in the air, its weight a silent promise of judgment to come. And, in that moment, Lena Carter stood as both defendant and enigma, ready to let the truth unfold, one measured breath at a time. The Grand County courtroom held its breath as Officer Nathan Pierce settled into the witness stand, the creak of the wooden chair slicing through the stillness like a knife. The morning light had shifted, now slashing sharper angles across the oak floor, glinting off the brass buttons of Pierce's pristine uniform. He adjusted his posture with a theatrical flair, shoulders squared, chin tilted just so, a man accustomed to commanding rooms, not just street corners. His pale blue eyes swept the gallery, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he savored the weight of every gaze pinned on him. The crowd, locals, reporters, a scattering of tense onlookers, leaned forward, their murmurs fading into a hush, eager for the tale he'd spin. Judge Edwin Marshall peered over his wire-rimmed glasses, his weathered face a mask of neutrality tinged with the exhaustion of too many years untangling lies from truth. "Officer Pierce," he said, his voice a low rumble, "please recount the events of the night in question." Pierce nodded, clearing his throat with a practiced rasp, his tone loud enough to carry to the back row, yet smooth as polished steel. "It was around 11:30 p.m., Your Honor," he began, his words deliberate, each one a brick in the wall he was building. "I was on patrol near the east end of town, quiet night mostly, till I got a call about a disturbance near the old hardware store on Cedar Street." Lena Carter sat at the defense table, her rich brown skin catching the faint glow of a nearby lamp. Her gray blouse a muted shield against the room's scrutiny. Her braided hair rested neatly atop her head, and her hands lay clasped in her lap, still, precise, a soldier's hands at rest. Her hazel eyes locked onto Pierce, dissecting him with a quiet intensity that went unnoticed by most. She noted the way his fingers flexed briefly against the stand's edge, the subtle shift in his weight as he leaned forward. A man performing, not confessing. To the gallery, he was a figure of authority. To her, a puzzle of tells she'd already begun to unravel. Pierce's voice rolled on, gaining momentum. "I saw her, Ms. Carter, standing there, just outside the store. Place was closed, lights off, nobody around. Looked suspicious to me. Loitering ain't exactly normal at that hour." A ripple of whispers snaked through the crowd. Loitering was a familiar charge in this town, a catch-all that often landed on shoulders like Lena's. He pressed forward, unfazed. "I pulled up, stepped out, asked her what she was doing there. Simple question, right? But she got hostile, fast, wouldn't give her name, raised her voice, started acting like I had no right to be there." Jamal Hayes, Lena's attorney, scribbled notes at the defense table, his pen trembling slightly as he tried to keep pace. His youthful face, smooth, dark, framed by a crisp suit, tightened with a mix of nerves and determination, his brown eyes darting to Lena for a cue. She didn't offer one, her focus unwavering, her expression a fortress of calm. Pierce's tale grew bolder, his tone dipping into a theatrical cadence. "I tried to calm things down, told her to settle, just show me some ID, but she wouldn't have it. Next thing I know, she's swinging at me, caught me right here." He tapped his chest with a grimace, feigning a wince that drew sympathetic gasps from the gallery. The room buzzed louder, heads turning, a woman near the back muttering, "That don't sound right." Judge Marshall's gavel rapped once, a sharp crack that silenced the chatter. "Order!" he barked, his eyes narrowing at Pierce. "Continue, officer." Pierce nodded, his smirk flickering back as he leaned into the stand. "Then she went for my gun, hand right toward my holster. I had no choice, Your Honor. I grabbed her, restrained her. Couldn't let her escalate it further. The gasps swelled, a tide of shock washing over the benches, but Lena remained a statue, her face unreadable, her breathing steady, a calm that felt almost defiant. Pierce stepped down, his boots clicking with the same swagger he'd brought to the stand, tossing Lena a glance that carried a predator's certainty, brief, sharp, a dare she didn't blink at. He rejoined his table, sinking into his chair with an ease that bordered on amusement. His fellow officers in the back row nodding in silent approval, their blue uniforms a wall of solidarity. The prosecution rested, and the air thickened with the weight of his words, a story so polished it gleamed, convincing to most, a fortress of half-truths to the few who doubted. Jamal rose, his movements jerky with nerves, his voice wavering as he addressed the judge. Your Honor, we'd like to... Marshall cut him off, his tone brisk. Save it for cross-examination, Mr. Hayes. Let's move forward. Jamal nodded, sinking back into his seat, his eyes flicking to Lena for reassurance she didn't give. She leaned toward him, her whisper barely audible over the hum of the room. Stay steady, Jamal. Stick to what's real. He swallowed hard, clutching his pen tighter, her calm a lifeline he clung to, despite the storm brewing in his chest. The gallery shifted, whispers swelling into a low roar. Some bought Pierce's tale, hook, line, and sinker. Others squinted at the cracks, sensing something off but unable to name it. Lena sat unmoved, her hazel eyes tracing Pierce's retreat, cataloging the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his smirk faltered when their gazes locked. He thought he'd won this round, his lie a shield no one would pierce. But Lena knew better. Truth was a blade, patient and sharp, and she wielded it with a precision he couldn't fathom. The gavel hung in the air, its shadow looming, and as the courtroom settled, the stage was set for a reckoning no one saw coming. Jamal sank beside Lena, his notes crinkling under his grip, his breath uneven. He leaned toward her, his whisper a thread of desperation. We've got to hit back hard. His story's sticking. Lena's head tilted slightly, her hazel eyes finally meeting his, a glint of steel beneath her calm. Stay steady, Jamal, she murmured, her voice low, a lifeline cast in the storm. Stick to what's real. Let him dig his own grave. Her words were soft, but unyielding, a commander's quiet order, and Jamal nodded, clutching her reassurance like a shield against the chaos threatening to engulf him. Across the room, Pierce exchanged a glance with his fellow officers, a quick wink, a nod returned, their loyalty a fortress he leaned on. His smirk widened into a full grin, teeth flashing as he settled back, arms crossed, a man convinced his word was law. The gallery buzzed louder, whispers weaving a tapestry of belief and doubt. Some saw a hero in blue, others a shadow too smooth to trust. Reporters scribbled faster, pencils racing to capture the moment, while a woman in the third row twisted her handkerchief tighter, muttering, "Something ain't right here." Lena's calm deepened, her hands still in her lap, her breathing a metronome of control. She felt the room's pulse, the weight of Pierce's lie, the fragility of Jamal's nerves, the judge's impatient gavel poised to strike. She didn't move, didn't react. Her strength was in the waiting, in the precision of a mind trained to strike when the moment ripened. The truth was her weapon, and she'd wield it not with noise but with a force Pierce couldn't dodge. As the courtroom settled, the air thickened with unspoken stakes, the defense stirring like a tide ready to turn, and Lena Carter sat at its heart, silent, steady, a storm poised to break. The Grand County courtroom exhaled into a fragile stillness as the bailiff's voice rang out, crisp and commanding. The defense calls Ms. Lena Carter to the stand. A ripple of anticipation swept through the gallery, heads swiveling, whispers curling like smoke in the heavy air. The morning sun had climbed higher, its beams now slashing through the burgundy curtains in bright, unyielding streaks, bathing the polished oak floor in a golden haze. The crowd, locals with furrowed brows, reporters poised with pens, a few faces taut with quiet stakes, leaned forward, their eyes locking onto the woman at the defense table as she rose with a grace that belied the weight of the moment. Lena Carter stood, smoothing the hem of her gray blouse with a deliberate hand, her navy skirt swaying faintly as she stepped forward. Her rich brown skin caught the light, a soft sheen under the courtroom's hum, and her braided hair rested atop her head like a badge of order. Her hazel eyes swept the room, sharp, unblinking, a soldier's gaze that missed nothing. The reporter in the second row chewing his lip. The woman near the back twisting her handkerchief into knots. Officer Nathan Pierce's faint smirk, flickering at the plaintiff's table. She moved to the witness stand with measured steps, each one a quiet drumbeat, and settled into the chair, her spine a steel rod, her hands resting lightly on the edge, a picture of calm that felt almost defiant. Judge Edwin Marshall adjusted his glasses, his silver hair glinting as he leaned forward, his creased face a mask of weary curiosity. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice a low growl tempered by years on the bench. "You've heard the charges. Proceed with your testimony." The prosecutor, Victor Langston, rose from his seat, a wiry man with a sharp jaw and a suit that gleamed like his tongue, his dark eyes narrowing as he stepped toward her. "Ms. Carter," he began, his tone dripping with skepticism, "explain your actions on the night in question. Officer Pierce claims you resisted arrest and assaulted him. Care to enlighten us?" Lena leaned forward slightly, adjusting the microphone with a slow, deliberate touch, her voice emerging steady and clear, a river cutting through stone. "I can," she said, her hazel eyes locking onto Langston's with a force that made him blink. "But first, let me be clear. Officer Pierce's account isn't just wrong. It's a deliberate lie, crafted to mislead this court." A collective breath snagged in the room, a sharp intake that rippled through the benches. Langston's smirk faltered, his sharp features tightening, but he recovered with a scoff. "Bold words, Ms. Carter," he snapped. "Got any proof to back that up? Or are we just supposed to take your word over a sworn officer's?" Lena's gaze didn't waver, her calm deepening into something unshakable. "The truth will show itself soon enough," she said, her tone even, a promise wrapped in steel. "But since you asked, here's what happened." She paused, letting the silence stretch, her eyes sweeping the jury, 12 faces, a mix of doubt and curiosity, waiting for her to tip the scales. "That night, I was walking home from a friend's place. I stopped near Cedar and Fifth to check my phone. Needed directions. It's a quiet street, nothing unusual. That's when Officer Pierce rolled up." Jamal Hayes sat at the defense table, his youthful frame rigid, his brown eyes wide as he scribbled notes, his pen steadying with each word Lena spoke. Her calm was a lifeline, pulling him from the nerves that had gripped him earlier, and he leaned forward, hanging on her every syllable. Across the aisle, Pierce shifted in his chair, his smirk thinning, his pale blue eyes darting to his fellow officers in the back row, still a wall of blue, but their nods were less certain now, their loyalty teetering. "He came at me with his flashlight," Lena continued, her voice unwavering, shining it in my face, asking what I was doing there. His tone wasn't polite, it was sharp, demanding. I told him I was checking directions. He asked for my ID. I asked why. He hadn't given me a reason, and I wasn't breaking any law. A murmur snaked through the gallery, a low hum of recognition. Langston pounced, his voice cutting in. "So you challenged his authority?" He sneered, leaning closer, his sharp jaw jutting like a blade. Lena tilted her head slightly, her expression a fortress. "I questioned his motive," she corrected, her words crisp, unflinching. "I wasn't obstructing anything, wasn't trespassing. I wanted to know why he needed my ID. That's my right." The murmurs grew louder, a few heads nodding, locals who'd felt the sting of vague suspicions too often. Judge Marshall's gavel tapped once, a warning crack. "Order," he growled, his dark eyes narrowing at the gallery before shifting to Lena. "Go on." She nodded, her hands still in her lap, her rhythm unbroken. "He didn't like that. Got louder. Accused me of being uncooperative. I said I wasn't looking for trouble, but before I could finish, he grabbed my arm, hard." Her voice stayed steady, but a flicker of steel glinted in her eyes, a memory of violation she wouldn't let shake her. "I told him to let go. He gripped tighter, said, 'People like you need to know your place.'" Gasps erupted, sharp and jagged, slicing through the room. The woman with the handkerchief pressed it to her mouth, her eyes wide. Langston's smirk vanished, his sharp features darkening as he scrambled to regain footing. "That's a serious claim, Ms. Carter," he said, his tone tight. "No proof of that. His body camera conveniently malfunctioned. Yes?" Lena's gaze pierced him, unflinching. "Convenient for him, maybe," she replied, her voice a quiet blade. "But truth doesn't need a camera. It finds a way." The gallery buzzed louder, a tide of doubt swelling. Pierce shifted again, his hands clenching the armrests, sweat beading on his brow as Lena's words took root. Jamal leaned forward, his pen pausing, a spark of hope lighting his eyes. Langston pressed on, his voice rising. "So, no evidence? Just your story against his?" Lena smiled faintly, a subtle shift, a crack in her calm that hinted at a storm beneath. "Not for long," she said, her tone a promise that hung heavy, a seed planted in the fertile ground of the courtroom's silence. The truth was stirring, its roots breaking through, and as Lena sat back, the room felt the first tremors of a reckoning she'd waited to unleash. Victor Langston adjusted his tie, his sharp jaw jutting forward, his wiry frame coiled with a predator's energy. His dark eyes glinted as he stepped closer, his voice slicing through the hush like a blade. "Ms. Carter," he began, his tone dripping with calculated skepticism, "you've painted quite a picture. Officer Pierce grabbing you, making threats, all unprovoked. Yet you expect this court to believe a decorated officer fabricated this tale?" He leaned in, his sharp features tightening into a smirk. "That's a bold accusation. Where's your proof?" Lena's posture remained a steel pillar, her hands resting lightly on the stand's edge, her voice emerging clear and measured, a river carving through rock. "Proof?" she replied, her hazel eyes locking onto his with a force that made his smirk flicker. "Officer Pierce's story is a house of cards, built on lies, shaky from the start. I've told you what happened. The truth doesn't need props to stand, it holds its own." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a low swell of recognition. Langston's smirk vanished, his jaw clenching as he scrambled to regain traction. He straightened, his voice rising, sharp and biting. "So, you admit you questioned his authority?" he pressed, pouncing on her earlier words like a trap snapping shut. "You challenged him? Refused to comply?" Lena tilted her head slightly, her expression a fortress of calm, her gaze piercing through his bravado. "I questioned his motive," she corrected, her words crisp, unyielding. "He approached me with no cause, flashlight in my face, demanding my ID. I asked why. That's not defiance, it's my right." The murmurs grew louder, a few heads nodding, locals who'd tasted the bitterness of baseless stops, their whispers a quiet chorus of, "She's got a point." Judge Edwin Marshall's gavel cracked once, a sharp rap that sliced the buzz. "Order," he growled, his silver hair glinting as he leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing at the gallery before settling on Lena. "Continue, Miss Carter." She nodded, her rhythm unbroken, her voice steady as she picked up the thread. "I told him I was checking directions. Simple as that. He didn't care. Accused me of being uncooperative, raised his voice. I said I wasn't looking for trouble, but he grabbed my arm before I could finish, hard enough to bruise." Her tone stayed even, but a flicker of steel glinted in her eyes, a shadow of the violation she refused to let shake her. Gasps erupted, jagged and sharp, cutting through the room. The woman with the handkerchief pressed it to her lips, her eyes wide with disbelief. Across the aisle, Nathan Pierce shifted in his chair, his pale blue eyes darting to his fellow officers in the back row, their nods faltering, their blue wall showing cracks. Sweat beaded on his brow, his smirk thinning into a tight line as Lena's words landed like blows. Langston pounced again, his voice a whip. "You're saying he restrained you without cause? A trained officer felt threatened enough to act, and you did nothing to provoke it?" Lena's gaze didn't waver, her hands still in her lap, her calm deepening into something immovable. "Yes," she said, her voice a quiet thunder. "I told him to let go, calmly, clearly. He gripped tighter, said, 'People like you need to know your place.'" The courtroom ignited, a wave of gasps louder now, a tide of shock and anger swelling through the benches. The woman in the back muttered, "That's out of line," her voice trembling. A reporter's pen froze mid-scratch, his jaw dropping. Judge Marshall's gavel slammed harder, twice, his face darkening. "Order," he barked, his tone a whip cracking through the chaos. "I will not have interruptions. Proceed." Langston forced a smile, his sharp features straining as he fought to regain control. "That's a grave claim, Ms. Carter," he said, his voice tight, edged with desperation. "You allege he said that, yet there's no proof. His body camera malfunctioned, as we've established. Convenient for you, isn't it?" Lena's eyes pierced him, unflinching, a faint curve touching her lips, a smile not of triumph, but of certainty. "Convenient for him," she countered, her tone a blade-honed sharp. "He grabbed me, accused me of resisting when I pulled away, tried to twist my arm free. Then he slammed me against his car. No provocation, no threat, just his need to dominate." The gallery buzzed, a low roar of disbelief and outrage. Jamal Hayes leaned forward at the defense table, his brown eyes wide, his pen scribbling furiously as hope flared in his chest. Langston's smile faded, his sharp jaw twitching as he pressed on. "No proof of that either, just your word against his, and this resisting. You pulled away, you admit it?" Lena's calm held, her voice steady as granite. "I pulled away after he violated my rights, grabbed me without cause. I didn't strike him, didn't lunge. He's the one who escalated." Pierce shifted again, his hands clenching the armrests, sweat now streaking his temples as Lena's testimony carved through his tail. Langston's voice rose, a last grasp at dominance. "You're a strong woman, Ms. Carter. Couldn't he have felt threatened by your resistance?" Lena's smile vanished, her hazel eyes narrowing slightly, a storm flickering beneath her calm. "I'm not stronger than a trained officer," she said, her words a quiet detonation. "And let's be clear, I didn't resist until he crossed the line. He claimed I reached for his gun. That's a lie, a fiction to justify his force." The room froze, Pierce's unease palpable, Langston's face darkening as he struggled to counter her unshakable resolve. The truth was taking root, its tendrils breaking through the cracks of Pierce's story. And as Lena sat back, the courtroom felt the shift, a clash of words tilting toward a reckoning she'd long prepared to unleash. The Grand County courtroom crackled with tension, the air thick as a storm about to break. The midday sun streamed through the burgundy curtains, its golden beams slashing across the oak floor and glinting off the worn benches packed with onlookers, locals gripping armrests, reporters poised with pens, a woman in the back row clutching her handkerchief like a lifeline. Lena Carter sat on the witness stand, her rich brown skin catching the light, her gray blouse and navy skirt a quiet shield against the storm of scrutiny. Her braided hair rested atop her head like a crown of resolve, and her hazel eyes, sharp, unyielding, tracked every movement in the room with a soldier's precision. Her testimony had just carved a rift through Officer Nathan Pierce's tale, and the gallery buzzed with a restless hum, a tide of doubt swelling beneath the surface. Victor Langston, the prosecutor, stood rigid, his sharp jaw clenched, his wiry frame taut with frustration. His dark eyes flickered as he faced Lena, his voice a strained whip after her damning words. "You expect us to believe Officer Pierce invented this entire encounter, threats, assault, all of it, without a shred of evidence?" he pressed, his tone edged with desperation. Lena's calm held like granite, her hands resting lightly on the stand, her voice steady as a blade. "I expect the truth to stand on its own," she said, her hazel eyes piercing him. "His story's a lie, and it's unraveling." A murmur rippled through the room, sharp and jagged. Langston's smirk twisted into a scowl, his control slipping as her words took root. Before he could counter, Jamal Hayes rose from the defense table, his youthful frame steadier now, his charcoal suit crisp against the courtroom's glow. His brown eyes burned with a newfound fire, his nerves tempered by Lena's unshakable presence beside him. He clutched a USB drive in his hand, his voice cutting through the hum with a quiet strength. "Your Honor," he said, turning to Judge Edwin Marshall, "the defense has evidence, video proof, that contradicts Officer Pierce's account." The gallery erupted, a wave of gasps and whispers crashing through the benches. The woman with the handkerchief gasped audibly, her eyes wide. Pierce shifted in his chair at the plaintiff's table, his pale blue eyes darting, sweat streaking his brow as his smirk vanished. Langston shot to his feet, his sharp features darkening with fury. "Objection, Your Honor!" he barked, his voice shrill. "This is irregular. The defense should have submitted this earlier. It's a stunt." Judge Marshall leaned forward, his silver hair glinting, his creased face hardening as he raised a hand to silence the outburst. "Overruled," he growled, his dark eyes narrowing at Langston. "Sit down, Mr. Langston. If there's evidence, we'll see it. Proceed, Mr. Hayes." Langston sank back, his jaw twitching, his hands clenching the table as Jamal stepped toward the bailiff, handing over the drive with a nod. The courtroom held its breath as the bailiff inserted the USB into the media system, the wall-mounted screen flickering to life with a faint hum. The footage was shaky, captured through a car window by a bystander, a grainy glimpse of a dark street, Cedar and Fifth, the night pierced by the harsh beam of Pierce's flashlight. The audio crackled but rang clear, a dagger through the silence. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Pierce's voice snapped, sharp and commanding, his figure looming as he gripped Lena's arm. Her voice followed, calm but firm. "I'm not resisting. Let go of my arm." A collective gasp ripped through the gallery as the screen showed Pierce shoving her against his patrol car, his words biting through the night. "People like you don't question me." The room exploded, shouts, gasps, a roar of outrage swelling from the benches. The woman with the handkerchief pressed it to her mouth, tears brimming. A reporter's pen clattered to the floor, his jaw slack. Judge Marshall's gavel slammed down, 3 sharp cracks that echoed like gunfire. "Order!" he bellowed, his face darkening with a mix of frustration and grim resolve. "I will clear this courtroom if I have to. Settle down." The noise subsided, a trembling hush falling as eyes turned back to the screen, the footage freezing on Pierce's snarl, Lena's arm pinned against the car, a tableau of truth that shattered his polished lie. Pierce slumped in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests, his face pale as sweat streaked his temples. His fellow officers in the back row exchanged uneasy glances, their blue wall fracturing, nods replaced by frowns, loyalty teetering on the edge of doubt. Langston stood frozen, his sharp jaw slack, his voice faltering as he grasped for a rebuttal. This doesn't show everything," he stammered, his tone weak. "It's out of context, doesn't prove she didn't resist earlier." Jamal turned to him, his voice steady now, edged with steel. "It proves enough," he said, gesturing to the screen. "It proves he lied about the assault, the gun, the whole encounter. That's not law enforcement, that's abuse." Lena sat unmoved, her calm a stark contrast to the chaos her words and the video had unleashed. Her hazel eyes traced Pierce's collapse, noting the tremble in his hands, the way his shoulders hunched as if shrinking under the weight of exposure. She hadn't drawn her sharpest blade yet. Her Navy SEAL legacy remained sheathed, but this hidden blade, the bystander's footage, had sliced through Pierce's tail, leaving it bleeding on the courtroom floor. The gallery buzzed with a quieter intensity now, a mix of awe and anger simmering as the truth took deeper root. Jamal faced Judge Marshall, his youthful frame radiating a quiet confidence. "Your Honor," he said, "this video shows what really happened. Officer Pierce's actions were unprovoked, excessive, and based on bias. We have more to present, but this alone dismantles his story." Marshall nodded, his gavel hovering, his dark eyes flicking to Pierce with a glint of suspicion. "Noted, Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone heavy. "Court will take a brief recess, 15 minutes. I suggest all parties prepare accordingly." The gavel fell, a final crack that sealed the moment, and the room erupted into whispers as the crowd spilled into the hallway. Lena stepped down, her movements deliberate, her calm unshaken as she rejoined Jamal at the defense table. He turned to her, his brown eyes wide with exhilaration, his voice a whisper. "That tore him apart, Lena. We've got him now." She nodded faintly, a subtle curve touching her lips. Not triumph, but certainty. "It's a start, Jamal," she murmured, her tone a quiet vow. "The wall's cracking. Let's keep pushing." The hidden blade had struck, but her full truth waited, poised to shatter what remained, and as the courtroom emptied, the air thrummed with the promise of a reckoning yet to come. Lena Carter rose from the defense table, her rich brown skin catching the light, her gray blouse and navy skirt a quiet armor against the storm of scrutiny. Her braided hair sat coiled atop her head like a crown of resolve, and her hazel eyes, sharp, unyielding, swept the room with a soldier's precision. She moved to the stand with measured steps, each one a quiet thunder, and settled into the chair, her spine a steel rod, her hands resting lightly on the edge. The gallery hushed, a collective breath held as Jamal Hayes approached, his youthful frame steady now, his charcoal suit crisp with newfound confidence. His brown eyes glinted with determination, the video's impact fueling a fire that burned away his earlier nerves. Judge Edwin Marshall leaned forward, his silver hair glinting, his creased face a mask of stern curiosity. "Mr. Hayes," he rumbled, his voice a low growl tempered by years of judgment. "You've presented your video. What's next?" Jamal nodded, turning to Lena, his tone firm yet reverent. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice carrying across the room, "you've heard the accusations. Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, attempting to seize a weapon. Officer Pierce painted you as a threat. But there's more to you than meets the eye, isn't there?" The gallery leaned in, a ripple of anticipation swelling. Pierce shifted in his chair at the plaintiff's table, his pale blue eyes narrowing, sweat streaking his brow as his smirk faded. Lena's posture held, her calm deepening into something monumental, a mountain unmoved by the wind. She leaned forward slightly, her voice emerging clear and steady, a blade cutting through the silence. "Yes," she said, her hazel eyes sweeping the jury. 12 faces, a mix of awe and skepticism, waiting for her to tip the balance. "There's more." She paused, letting the weight settle, her gaze shifting to Pierce, then back to the room, commanding every corner with a presence that swelled beyond her frame. "I am Lieutenant Commander Lena Carter, retired Navy SEAL." The courtroom erupted, a tidal wave of gasps, shouts, and stunned whispers crashing through the benches. The woman with the handkerchief dropped it, her hands flying to her mouth. A reporter's pen clattered to the floor, his jaw slack. Judge Marshall's gavel froze midair, his dark eyes widening as the revelation sank in, his stoic mask cracking with a flicker of awe. Across the aisle, Pierce slumped, his face paling to a ghostly white, his hands clenching the armrests as if to anchor himself against the collapse of his tale. His fellow officers in the back row froze, their blue wall crumbling, nods replaced by gaping stares, loyalty dissolving into shock. Lena continued, her voice unwavering, each word a hammer striking steel. "For 20 years, I served this country. Combat zones, covert ops, leading teams through dangers most can't imagine. I've faced enemies with guns, bombs, and worse, and I've done it with discipline, precision, and honor." The gallery fell silent, the earlier chaos yielding to a reverent hush, as her words painted a legacy that dwarfed the room. "I've stared down death and walked away. Qualities I carry every day, whether on a battlefield or a quiet street in Nebraska." Jamal stepped closer, his voice rising with conviction. "As a Navy SEAL, Ms. Carter, you were trained to handle high-pressure situations. Did you use that training during your encounter with Officer Pierce?" Lena's gaze didn't waver, her calm a beacon in the storm she'd unleashed. "Yes," she said, her tone firm, unyielding. "I used it to stay calm, to de-escalate, to protect myself without escalating to violence. I assessed him, his stance, his tone, his aggression, and responded with control. He wasn't a threat to my safety, just to my dignity." The jury's eyes widened, a mix of respect and disbelief washing over their faces. A juror in the front row, a middle-aged man with a gray beard, nodded faintly, his skepticism melting into awe. Langston shot to his feet, his sharp jaw twitching, his voice a desperate rasp. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked. "This is irrelevant. Her past doesn't change the facts of that night." Marshall's gavel tapped once, a quiet crack. "Overruled," he said, his tone heavy with finality. "Sit down, Mr. Langston. This goes to credibility, hers and his. Proceed, Mr. Hayes." Jamal nodded, turning back to Lena, his fire blazing. "Did you, at any point, attempt to harm Officer Pierce or reach for his weapon?" Lena's voice rang clear, a quiet thunder that filled the room. "No," she said, her hazel eyes piercing Pierce across the aisle. "My training taught me to assess threats and act accordingly. Pierce wasn't a threat, just a bully with a badge. I didn't strike him, didn't lunge. Those are lies he spun to justify his actions. I refused to let him strip me of my rights, and he couldn't handle that." The courtroom ignited again, a roar of applause, gasps, and shouts swelling from the benches, unstoppable this time. The woman in the back clapped fiercely, tears streaming. Reporters scribbled with frantic speed, their pens racing to capture the moment. Marshall's gavel slammed repeatedly, his face a storm of frustration and respect. "Order!" he bellowed, his voice cracking through the chaos. "I will have order, or I'll clear this room." The noise subsided. a trembling hush falling as Lena's valor hung in the air, a force that reshaped the battlefield. Pierce shrank in his chair, his hands trembling, his face a mask of humiliation, as the jury's eyes turned to him, not with trust, but with burning doubt. Langston sat pale, his sharp features slumped, his rebuttal silenced by the weight of her truth. Jamal placed a hand on Lena's shoulder as she stepped down, his voice a whisper of triumph. "You've got them, Lena. They see you now." She nodded faintly, her hazel eyes glinting with a quiet storm. "Let's finish it," she murmured, her calm unshaken, her valor unveiled. A blade that had struck deep, leaving Pierce's lies in tatters and the courtroom forever changed. The Grand County courtroom hung in a fragile electric stillness as the afternoon sun dipped lower, its amber rays piercing the burgundy curtains and bathing the oak floor in a warm, resolute glow. The benches brimmed with a restless crowd, locals gripping their seats, reporters poised with notepads, the woman with the handkerchief now clutching it in quiet triumph. Lena Carter's revelation, Lieutenant Commander, retired Navy SEAL, still echoed through the room, a seismic shift that had shattered Officer Nathan Pierce's tail and left the gallery reeling with awe. Her gray blouse and navy skirt framed her with understated strength, her braided hair a crown of discipline atop her head, and her hazel eyes, sharp, unyielding, surveyed the space with a calm that commanded reverence. Nathan Pierce slumped at the plaintiff's table, his once crisp uniform now a wrinkled shell, his pale blue eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Sweat streaked his brow, his hands trembling as they gripped the armrests. His smirk long vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace of defeat. His fellow officers in the back row sat rigid, their blue wall crumbled into a scattering of uneasy glances, their loyalty fractured by the weight of Lena's truth. The jury, 12 faces, a mix of resolve and quiet fury, watched him with eyes that no longer trusted, their skepticism turned to conviction by the video and her valor. Judge Edwin Marshall leaned forward, his silver hair glinting, his creased face stern, yet tinged with a rare respect as he addressed the room. "Counselors," he rumbled, his voice a gravelly anchor, "we'll move to closing arguments. Mr. Langston, you're up." Victor Langston rose stiffly from his seat, his sharp jaw clenched, his wiry frame taut with a desperation he couldn't mask. His dark eyes flickered as he adjusted his tie, his voice emerging strained, a shadow of its earlier vigor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his tone measured but faltering, "this case hinges on facts, not feelings. Officer Pierce made a judgment call, an officer's split-second decision in a tense moment. Mistakes may have occurred, but his intent was to protect the public. The defense has woven a compelling story, video, credentials, but it doesn't erase the reality." Ms. Carter resisted, escalated the situation. "Don't let emotion sway you from the law." His words landed flat, his sharp features paling as he sat, the gallery's silence a heavy rebuke. Jamal Hayes rose next, his youthful frame radiating a steady fire, his charcoal suit crisp with purpose. His brown eyes burned with conviction as he faced the jury, his voice ringing clear and fierce. "This isn't complex, it's clear as day. Lena Carter, a Navy SEAL hero, was targeted, assaulted, and lied about by a man abusing his power." He gestured to Lena, who sat with her back straight, her hands clasped, unshaken, a pillar of strength. She didn't resist. She asked why. For that, Pierce attacked her, humiliated her, then fabricated a story to cover it. "You've seen the video, heard her truth. This is about accountability. When those sworn to serve fail, justice must prevail. You hold that power today." The courtroom fell silent, Jamal's words a thunderclap that lingered, the jury nodding faintly. A middle-aged man with a gray beard, a young woman with wide eyes, their faces etched with resolve. Lena's gaze swept the room, her hazel eyes steady. A quiet storm of dignity and defiance. Pierce shrank further, his hands clenching, his face a mask of dread as the scales tipped visibly against him. Judge Marshall cleared his throat, his dark eyes grave. "The jury will now deliberate," he said, his gavel striking once, a final note as they filed out, leaving the room in a hush of anticipation. Hours stretched like days in the courthouse hallway, where Lena sat on a bench, her hands clasped tightly, her calm unshaken. Jamal paced nearby, his brow furrowed, his pen tapping his palm, a nervous rhythm against her stillness. "They've got to see it," he muttered, glancing at her. "The video, your record, it's undeniable." Lena looked up, her voice soft but resolute. "They don't need to see it, Jamal. They need to feel it. Truth cuts deeper than facts." He nodded, a flicker of a smile breaking through, her words a lifeline in the wait. The bailiff's call broke the silence. "The jury has a verdict." And the courtroom swelled again, every seat filled, the air thick with expectation. Lena stood beside Jamal at the defense table, her posture a soldier's, her face an unreadable mask. Pierce sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on the jury box, his knuckles white. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a firm jaw, rose as Judge Marshall nodded. "Please read the verdict," he said, his tone heavy. "In the case of State versus Lena Carter," she began, her voice steady, "we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." A wave of gasps and cheers erupted, unstoppable, the gallery surging with emotion. The woman with the handkerchief clapped fiercely, tears streaming. Reporters scribbled frantically, their pens racing. "Furthermore," the forewoman continued, her voice rising, "we recommend a full investigation into Officer Pierce's conduct." The room roared again, Marshall's gavel pounding futilely as the tide of justice broke free. Lena exhaled softly, her shoulders easing for the first time in days, a quiet victory settling in her bones. Jamal gripped her shoulder, his smile wide, his voice a whisper of triumph. "We did it, Lena. They saw you." She nodded, her hazel eyes glinting with resolve. "It's bigger than me," she murmured, her tone a vow. Pierce sat frozen, his face ashen, his hands trembling as Marshall's voice cut through. "Officer Pierce," he said gravely, "retain counsel. This isn't over for you." The gavel fell, a final crack sealing his fate. Outside, the courthouse steps swarmed with cameras and microphones, the Nebraska dusk painting the sky in streaks of gold. Lena emerged, her presence commanding as she faced the press, her voice steady. "This isn't just my win, it's for accountability, for every voice silenced by power. I had help, and I'll keep fighting." The crowd erupted in applause, Jamal beside her, pride radiating as she turned away, leaving the chaos behind. Months later, Pierce was dismissed, charged with perjury and misconduct, his allies scattering as investigations unveiled his abuses. Lena resumed her quiet life, her name a beacon of resilience, a warrior whose valor tipped the scales, proving justice bends toward those who stand unbroken. As the Nebraska dusk painted the sky in golden streaks, Lena Carter stood on the courthouse steps, her silhouette steady against the fading light. A cop's lie had crumbled under her truth, a Navy SEAL's valor proving stronger than abuse of power. From a midnight stop to a courtroom victory, Lena turned pain into purpose, showing that justice bends toward those who stand tall. Her story whispers hope. No matter the odds, one voice can break through, one fight can change everything. Courage isn't loud, it's unshakable, and it's in us all. If Lena's journey inspired you, hit that subscribe button. More stories of resilience and redemption await. Comment with your thoughts or your city. I'd love to hear from you. Let's keep shining light on what's right. See you in the next one.